Tapui Tokutanga Kaitiaki o Aotearoa, and I'm very pleased to be here. My respect and thanks to the tangata whenua o Tamaki Makaurau, and to Jane and also the University of Auckland for hosting us, and most of all to you people who have come, and either in reality or virtually. Our topic is health, which I hope my speakers are going to come up here soon. No, we are waiting on one of them, but she will be here. She's on her way, yes. Oh. Thank you. And we're talking about health, not only the health of people, but also the health of the planet. And you might be forgiven for thinking that health and trade, or healthy trade, is a bit of an oxymoron. But hopefully with our wonderful distinguished panel here, they will be able to explore some ideas for a trade policy framework, because trade is intrinsic to what we do. We exchange ideas, we exchange goods. Some ideas, some principles and stuff to inform trade agreements that actually deliver the equity, health and well-being to everyone, not just to the privileged few, as is the current situation. So just a bit about the format. I'm going to ask a brief question for our speakers to answer before going into some more substantive questions. And then I'm going to take some questions from the floor, or if you write it on a note and give to Stephen, who's somewhere, or to Jane, who will pass them on to me. But I'll also ask questions from the floor too, so hopefully you'll have a time to speak. Okay, let's get started. So I think Lena's just coming in now. Yes. So, got Lena. So we're going to actually start though with Michael Waits. Actually, do you mind if I'm going to sit down, because I don't like sort of standing up in this thing here, I think, because I do want it to be more of a conversation. Right, so Michael Waits is a registered nurse and midwife, and despite his youthful appearance, has been an active unionist for the last 20 years. He's now working as an organiser for the Australian Nurses and Midwives Federation of Australia from New South Wales. But he's also the Sub-Secretary for the Oceania region for the Public Service International, and he has been an absolutely tireless campaigner and organiser of campaigns to addressing, the sort of big four in this area, which is PACER Plus, TPP, TESA and RCEP, fighting to get better world service agreements for people. So, Michael, I want to ask you about something that happened recently. The World Bank issued a report in which they suggested that the respective labour problems for Pacific Island nations in Aotearoa, sort of not enough work in one country and skill shortages in another, could be magically fixed by moving Pacific peoples, young Pacific peoples, to Aotearoa to work in aged care facilities. And it certainly got short shrift from NZ&O and also from our Pacific Nurses section, but a lot of people would think that's a win-win situation, and it's certainly been the basis of a lot of trade agreements. Why is that not healthy trade, or what's wrong with that?
Thanks, Marilyn. Particularly for the reference to my youthful looks, I'll take that.
Michael?
One of the key campaign goals for Public Services International is to achieve a minimum safe staffing levels in healthcare, whether that's aged care or whether that's acute care, and also in maintaining adequate qualifications of staff that are providing that care wherever those services may be. So an example of that is minimum carer ratios in aged care. That's a campaign that's running in Australia at the moment. And I want to mention just one of the big players in aged care in Australia, because I'll come back to it, and that's Bupa, which I know is also active here in New Zealand. And aged care in Australia is coming under the spotlights in many ways. There's been exposure of resident abuse, exposure of massive understaffing, but also exposure of tax avoidance by the aged care for-profit providers. And the way aged care is funded in Australia is 75% of their funding comes from the government providing the cash for them to provide care. So taxpayers are paying money, government's taking that money, giving it to aged care providers who are cutting staffing levels, cutting qualifications, to the point where a carer is on average required to get a resident up, out of bed, showered and dressed in 6 minutes. 6 minutes. Just impossible. And when we put that to the aged care providers, they said, well, that's an average, it's just an average, right? Now, you can see that this exploitation and abuses, and the lowest paid workers in Australia, some of the lowest paid workers in Australia, poor working conditions, poor agreements, and they're just put in untenable positions trying to provide care to residents. It's gotten so bad that there is now a Royal Commission into aged care in Australia, and there is also a Senate inquiry into the tax avoidance practices of these for-profits. So in this mix, you know, the staffing crisis in aged care in Australia is not because there's not enough people out there to work, it's because people don't want to be put in that sort of working condition. People leave that sort of working condition because morally they can't stand it, economically they can't stand it, physically they can't stand it. And into this, they want to say that the answer is people from the Pacific Islands. It's really quite a racist view, that workers from another country should come and do the work that no one else in Australia is prepared to do. And you might sort of cop that when you're thinking about fruit picking. When you're talking about the care of a person in a care facility, then the moral outrage has got many avenues to run down. And the problem with the free trade agreements is this whole standstill and ratchet approach to regulation, which means that if the unions in Australia were successful in getting the safe staffing levels into legislation, if we can do that before we have a free trade agreement that involves Bupa, then we're okay. We won't get it afterwards. We won't be able to say to these private employers, actually, you have a minimum staffing level that you need to apply. So you can see that the way that the free trade agreements are impacting on this, the way that they protect companies for maintaining their tax avoidance, the way that they smash trade union rights, the way that they hamper what we would say is decent regulation is deeply problematic.
That's fantastic, and that's also, you know, your experience in Australia is exactly the same as what's happening here. Sure. I'm going to turn to Lena. Lena Mangani is a coordinator for Médecins Sans Frontières. She coordinates the Access campaign in India for affordable medicines. And this is a big campaign that was launched by MSF in the later stages of the RCEP negotiations to try and oppose proposals that would undermine access to medicines. So can I ask you to tell me more about the campaign and how trade agreements, I thought trade agreements were supposed to free up medicines, you know, so that poor countries could get medicines, and, you know, why does it not work that way?
I think it just does the opposite. Trade agreements, they actually put up barriers to legitimate trade in affordable medicines. So the crux, if you, I mean, then in a nutshell, what I would say is this, that developing countries have been fighting to make medicines themselves, you know, to develop the technology. And India is one of those few countries that, a very interesting story about Gandhi and World War II, shortages of medicines, and Gandhi basically said that we should make our own medicines and we should start, developing generic medicines. And some of the first facilities to make medicines in India were set up in post-World War II, where Gandhi basically envisaged India being able to make the medicines it needed. And subsequently, the level of organic chemistry and other technical knowledge in India was quite high. The education system did develop that. And we went on to actually develop the technology to make almost any medicine we wanted. That includes injectables, biologicals, small molecules. And having said that, while in the 70s, the aim was basically to meet the needs in India, it's sort of by 90s had grown into a situation where countries who couldn't access big pharma's medicines due to prices had started to look towards India to try and buy the same medicines. And that's how MSF came to India. We started to talk to the generic companies there during the AIDS crisis, where about 600 people were dying in South Africa every day. 8,000 people were dying across the world in developing countries due to AIDS. And we found that Indian companies had the capacity to make medicines and good quality medicines at a very low cost. They were very competitive. They could make pediatric formulations. They could make fixed dose combinations of AIDS medicines. And since then, many developing countries have started to buy medicines from India. And this is starting to become kind of a developing country phenomena, where you see Thailand, Brazil, Bangladesh and others trying to make medicines. And now these trade agreements, the first one was the TRIPS agreement, the World Trade Organization, they're trying to put up the barriers so that countries can't trade in legitimate generic medicines. And that's the problem. If you don't challenge these trade agreements, they are basically, they play into big pharma's hand, and big pharmaceutical corporations love monopolies, and they like to prescribe monopolies, and they prescribe these monopolies through the free trade agreements. So you will see Pfizer's hand on the World Trade Organization's TRIPS agreement, but you will also see big pharma's hand in the Trans-Pacific Agreement, and now in RCEP you have pharmaceutical corporations repeating the very same prescriptions for monopolies that they would very much like, keeping medicine prices very high.
And so that price becomes a barrier for a long time.
Absolutely. If you look at prices today, and this is a difference when I'm working in different countries, and it's such a privilege to be here, because I was talking to a cousin who we both grew up. He grew up in India, and we were both there, and I met him after years. And I said, he told me how he accesses his asthma medicines. He basically pays a very small amount, and the rest of it comes from the healthcare system. Now, if you look at the situation which governments are facing, like New Zealand or Australia, or in other countries who pay for healthcare, you have prices as insane as $1,000 a pill, which was the hepatitis C medicine, sofosbuvir, when it was first launched. New cancer therapies are average of $100,000 per patient per year. And our governments are expected to pay those kind of prices to big pharma without questioning the kind of monopolies they have, without questioning the prices they have. And I think this is where we need to start questioning what we are paying for the medicines. Why are we paying such high prices? Why are our governments paying such a high price when there's competition out there and they could, choose to procure much more affordably? But the trade agreements block that avenue for governments completely.
Thank you for that. Now we're going to move to Louise, right at the end. See this very well, healthily balanced panel here. Louise is a lawyer. She's also a lecturer in public health law at University of Otago, but her interests and her expertise extend way beyond that, basically around putting the common good first, I would say. She's a convener of the recently formed Tax Justice Network, Aotearoa New Zealand, which is allied to the UK version. And I know that she's an expert in this area and has been an advocate for a long time about having rules in trade agreements that actually put the common good first. Can you elaborate on that, Louise?
Thanks, Marilyn. Well, not an expert, but passionately interested. Yes, I am interested in rules. I am interested as a lawyer in the nitty-gritty of what words in treaties actually say and actually provide. Words are not magic, but they are the basic platform on which we, which we have values that underpin those words, and they provide means of expressing them. So I am interested in what treaties should actually say. A couple of colleagues and I spent a couple of years on a project in which we discussed, including and gathered ideas, including from a couple of people in this room, such as Barry and Bill and others, on what those rules should be. So we distilled our ideas on those rules in an article on the subject, which came out last year. It had as its flaws, it was from an international audience, but anyway, we came to the conclusion that there were some ideas for rules that formed a kind of checklist, and that if proposed trade treaties did not conform reasonably with those ideas and those rules, that we should simply just not sign them, and that that should be the basis of our advocacy. Those rules consisted of principles. I won't go on about that. A central rule is that the common good should be the overarching objective of all trade treaties. The common good including environmental outcomes and objectives, health ones, social justice, and infrastructure and economic functioning. So that should be the central goal. In addition, we had ideas on corporate responsibilities and changes to corporations and changes to corporate rights, that all trade treaties should spell out investor and corporate obligations as well as rights, that be buttressed by other forms of international law, such as the proposed Business and Human Rights Agreement mentioned yesterday by Jane. That all, that dispute settlement, obviously ISDS has to go, and that rule should spell out what alternative forms of dispute resolution should consist of. That all trade agreements, trade investment agreements, should have concrete forms of enforcement and incentives to comply with international agreed obligations, such as those in the Paris Agreement, as well as disincentives for those who don't. That investor rights certainly do not include ability to sue in any form, whether ISDS or any other form, for loss of future profits as a result of the government's right and obligation indeed to govern for the common good. Amongst other things, there should be strong connections between international law, which trade treaties are a form of, and national agreements to spell out and put conditions around investment, investor and corporate actions in a particular country. So those are some of the rules and some of the agreements. In addition, international law needs to spell out more concretely hierarchical issues, because at the moment, as was mentioned yesterday, environment treaties and health treaties, such as, although we don't actually have very many of them, but international health commitments and environmental obligations are basically trumped, which is now attaining, of course, a new meaning, that word, that trade and investment treaties and provisions take precedence over environmental and social justice provisions, that has to change and be actually included in both environmental treaties and in trade treaties. And enforceability should not be the kind of issue that it is. Naturally, trade treaties are the most enforceable kinds of treaties that we have, that can be changed if we are careful about the incentives and disincentives that we put in treaties. So we have a fairly holistic set of ideas for what actual words are in treaties, and underpinned, of course, by the values that we were talking about yesterday. And my view is that if we do not have something like those rules, then New Zealand's position should be simply not to sign.
That's telling them. Okay, thanks very much, Louise. And we move to George. George is a medical oncologist at Auckland DHB, specialising in respiratory malignancy, which is one of the reasons that he's been a very big advocate for smoke-free Aotearoa New Zealand. He was a former member of Pharmac's Pharmaceutical and Therapeutics Advisory Board Committee, which is an important role, and also of Te Ora, the Māori Medical Practitioners Association. He's currently president-elect of the New Zealand Medical Association. College of Physicians, I'm sorry, and also a very active member of Ora-Taio, the Climate and Health Council for Aotearoa. And I know that climate and health is your real specialty, but just because of the very, very special position that Pharmac has for New Zealand, Pharmac's the purchasing agency for medicines in New Zealand and has a very particular role in our health system, the jewel in the crown, it has sometimes been called. And things changed quite a lot in 2009 when suddenly, out of the blue, Pharmac had always been off limits in trade treaties. That was not on the table. All of a sudden, John Key, with no warning in 2009, said pharmaceuticals definitely were on the table in trade agreements, and that was certainly a catalyst for a number of health sector organisations, including NZNO and various other organisations, to take an active interest in trade treaties. So I wondered, from your perspective, why were the medical associations and nursing and everybody else up in arms about it, and what do you think is the what has been the effect of that?
Kia ora, Marilyn. Tō te mihi ki te mana whenua o te rohe nei ki Ngāti Whātua. So I suppose personally I'm not opposed to the idea of questioning and re-evaluating the value of our public institutions, and sometimes by doing that we actually realise how incredibly valuable they are to us. And so my interpretation of what the previous government did was to say that they might put Pharmac on the table as an institution that they might be willing to sacrifice if the exchange in their eyes was good enough. I think personally, my view, the short answer is that I think Pharmac basically came through that and weathered that period of uncertainty. They've had to change some of their processes around that heading that's called transparency, but I personally I feel that their fundamental ability to negotiate on price of medicines does remain intact.
It was that part of, I know that some of the negotiators have actually said this, that the huge upswell of interest and opinions from the sort of health sector was really instrumental in putting in place things to make sure that Pharmac still was able to, negotiate, to be able to, be able to function in the way that it does now. It has sort of a range of levers, doesn't it, that it can use to get the best price. Perhaps you could tell us, because our international audiences might not be aware of the role of Pharmac and how effective it's been.
Yeah, well, I think that's genuinely the phase of history that we're in, that civil society has to fight for the preservation of our public institutions. And so that happened, thank goodness. So I don't view the activities of Pharmac as really greatly different from the activities of, say, private healthcare insurance organisations that negotiate a lot on the price of medicines that come into their schemes. In the USA, my understanding is that the public agencies are forbidden to negotiate the price of drugs. So Medicaid can't negotiate on the asking price of drugs, but the health maintenance organisations, you know, they do that all the time. That's normal commercial practice. So really, for Pharmac to be able to do what it does, it has to be able to walk away from deals. It has to be able to say, no, we're not going to buy that because that's not value for money. Exactly as Lena says, the prices are outrageously high. It's profiteering, really. But once you get into that sort of market situation, you can walk away, and then the seller has to come back with a better price if they want to have a deal. And then the other part of the negotiations is having more than one seller. So if it's a monopoly situation, then Pharmac really is in a much trickier situation. And so I think that's where there's been anxiety about changes to patent law and increasing the length of patents on drugs, generic drugs and biosimilar drugs. Yeah, but as long as Pharmac can walk away from deals, and as long as there's competition amongst vendors, I think the fundamental is intact.
Right, thanks for that. And that actually gets us to an interesting position, because most of us understand about trading in drugs and medical devices, etc., because they're goods. But in the 21st century, there's a lot of trading in health services. And I know that there's a lot of international trade in there. Just what are some of the services, etc., that are being traded? You mentioned aged care, Michael. What else is happening internationally? I'll just open that up to the panel.
Well, yes, so goods, so products such as pharmaceuticals comes under the GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Services, of which we have a burgeoning amount, comes under GATS, which is General Agreement on Services. So it is pretty confusing to those two things, trade and services, sorry. I think we'd all know that GATS, the General Agreement on Trade and Services, is a tougher and more formal form of law than GATT, which is much older. And it covers services. You don't think of that with health over an international border, because we are talking about cross-border services here. But there are at least 4 different, major categories of, sorry about this mini lecture here, which include personnel, which we've talked about before, aged care, people coming in to do the work that, for various good reasons, we may not wish to. We in New Zealand or Aotearoa. But there's also medical tourism when we go overseas and when people come here. There's also technological services. So when I go in for my CAT scan, well, not that I have, but that may be read in another country than our own. And then there's also investment issues. Does a big company overseas like Bupa or anything else want to come in and set up their own hospital in New Zealand, or do our investors want to do that overseas? All those issues are covered by the General Agreement on Trade and Services, and they all pose issues which we simply haven't thought through. They include quality issues. People in Australia or India are generally just as good or even better than us at reading those CAT scans, but what if they aren't? What happens with quality issues, which we have seen lots of issues and scandals indeed in New Zealand? So what happens? We don't know what the international legislation or what frameworks are. We don't know what happens with privacy of our CAT scan when it goes off to Australia. Who guarantees who has access to that and under what conditions? And we don't know issues about quality, about privacy, and basically what happens when things go wrong. We have a rough idea about what happens with services which are done in New Zealand, but cross-border services are a whole different kettle of fish. So those are some of the issues which possibly clinicians know a tiny bit more than I do, but that's just a brief overview.
Anyone else? I think there's also the issue of, as you say, you mentioned briefly, you know, buying up whole chains of, I know that that's happening with opticians and dentists. I think you had that in
pharmacists.
In pharmacists, yes. And I think you had that in West Australia, didn't you, where they bought up a whole lot of GP practices, and that puts us a little bit at risk if there's sudden change. We want to change the conditions, and suddenly, you know, a multinational corporation or a chain just decides that the conditions aren't as good, and so they get out of that field, and then all of a sudden you're left high and dry. Yeah. It is interesting that where services are held, that the district nursing services, I think on Waiheke and Island, is owned by an Australian corporation, I think, similarly to South Island.
There's also the risk of what happens once you've surrendered your services to the market and the market fails. So there was a case in one of the Nordic countries, I can't remember the details, where an aged care provider company collapsed and something like 150,000 residents were suddenly having to be rehomed because that company collapsed. You know, this is, you know, one of the pervasive things about free trade agreements is that it undermines our public health system. And once you see the privatisation and the shift to healthcare, rather than it being a human right, being something that you obtain for profit, is deeply problematic. We have a banking royal commission in Australia at the moment that is showing that the financial sector was charging dead people for fees. It was, you know, just absolutely appalling. And you don't have companies like AMP come into aged care because they care deeply about the elderly residents. They care deeply about a profit, and they'll get it however they can. So the risk to our human right to health when we surrender it to the market through the free trade agreements can be catastrophic.
Right, thank you. I've got two questions here. I'm going to put them both at the same time and invite the panel to answer them. One of them, it actually borders on that last one, is that there are public health issues that are beyond medical care and clinical care, but are like junk food, smoking, pollution, and the health of the planet, of course. What prospects are there for binding international agreements, under who, to trump trade agreements? That's one question. And the other question, actually this is really specifically for George, who's active in Orotaio. Can you talk about the implications of trade agreements for climate change and health?
Thanks, Marilyn. Yeah, and I'll try and sort of weave both those things into there. But in answer to the first one, what I would hope is that this project would clarify the shape of an alternative and progressive approach to trade agreements that does protect health. Without having to depend on other international instruments and having conflict between those and trade agreements as we currently have. So what I wanted to do, and now this is speaking on behalf of Orotaio, the NZ Climate and Health Council, is I think open the focus a bit wider, because in my readings on this topic, a lot of the time the relationship between trade and health has been health's been conflated with health care, but fundamentally health runs through everything that we do. And in medicine, in health, we understand the social and environmental determinants of health, and that's what we're interested in, the health of people. And the economic settings that we have and the international trade settings are major determinants of the health of people. And of course, climate change is here. And becoming worse. My work in cancer medicine, you know, I have to give prognoses, and people are always optimistic. People will frequently more often than not, I suppose, are optimistic, want to be positive, you know, say, you know, we're going to beat this. But I think, as with cancer, as with climate change, we're going to take harm. We're going to take harm, and I think the best that we'll be able to do is to try to deflect as much as possible of that harm. And to achieve that deflection, we're going to have to make very fundamental changes, and we will. We will make fundamental changes. We can't just tinker at the margins, and that's my worry with conversations like this, that we talk in the context of the current approaches, and we're just tinkering away at the margins, and that's not what the future holds for us. The future holds quite fundamental change. And so in the invitation to think about this, we were invited as panellists to think about principles. And so coming from the Māori side, in reflecting on what the principles would be, I think we have to wind it right back to the very beginning, to kore, to pō, the separation of rangi and papa. By the atua tāne, the creation of the world of light. And so what I just wanted to do in a few following comments is build on that thought, and hopefully bring an interpretation of the current crisis that we have. So, you know, the tāne achieved the separation of rangi and papa, but wasn't able to sustain it. That was the problem. Tāne on his own was not able to sustain that separation. What the atua had to do was to prop up the heavens with poles, 4 poles, ngā pō tokorangi, and so once the heavens had been propped up with the poles, they tried it. It was after they failed the first time, but they eventually got there. That created the space within which humanity can operate, and I think that space is, you know, you can knock the poles out and the sky will fall down again, is the basic understanding. There are constraints on freedom of action in the space that the atua created for us. And the economic concept that we've been living under for the past 30, 40 years, the laissez-faire concept of unfettered freedom of action of markets, is seriously damaging the stability of the pillars of heaven. Basically, you know, our economy is like a bull in a china shop, and it's knocking away at the supports that we need to hold up the world to live in. So what we must do in designing the new approach is to reinstate higher principles than simple freedom of economic action. And in the Māori world, we appeal to our kaupapa values. Wairuatanga, mana tangata, kaitiakitanga, whanaungatanga. These are all there. These are known to us. And really, these ones are all the necessary preconditions for tino rangatiratanga, freedom of action. Now, there's a particular concept that I want to say the name of, tau utu utu, and that's the word for reciprocity. And so reciprocity is a very big thing in international, in trading situations, and has been since the year dot. And coming through from yesterday, I think that's what we've been missing a lot of, you know, in the trade agreements that we have had. There hasn't been a lot of reciprocity. There's been things out of balance. Some people are doing all the value adding in supply chains, and other people are left with being mines for extraction of natural resources. So there hasn't really been a concept of reciprocity in those levels. to have a chance at solving the climate change problem or surviving through it and deflecting as much of the harm as possible, it's my own belief that we have to reset the principles along those lines. I've got two more thoughts that follow on from it, if I may. Yeah. So corporates and land. So the first one is corporates. My personal view is that the corporations that we've created are indeed the alien invaders that Russell Norman told us about. They are kind of autonomous machines that we've created with their own programming. I don't think they're especially self-aware, but they do have programming and intelligence and objectives that are different from the values that I've tried to espouse. And the corporations appear big compared to us. They're distributed across our society. But one of the things that we've forgotten, or I think, one of the things that that's been overlooked is who are we? And we're not just the individual people here and now. We have whakapapa. We exist in deep time. Those of us in the room now are expressions of our whakapapa that goes through deep time and is much bigger than the corporations ultimately. And I believe that is a major source of our mana and power to regain control of these things that we've created. The second thing is, drawing from Margaret Mutu's comments, we must radically revise our relationship with the land. You don't carve up your mother and sell her piece by piece. And I think that's the fundamental problem with title. And I think that has been, that relationship to land has Ngāti Whātua said to us at the start, losing the land, alienation like that, has caused harm to health of Ngāti Whātua. And it's true. This is objectively true. From the medical side, no difficulty with that concept at all. So whatever policy we design, I think must include a fundamental reappraisal of relationship with land. It is possible to change major settings like that in international relations. I think about our Islamic brothers and sisters won't use interest, for example. So whole chunks of understanding of economies can be set aside, and you can find other ways. And New Zealand's been really influential with changing the understanding of the land, with the personhood of Te Urawera and of Whanganui Te Awa. And now I understand in India as well, there has been some interest in what's happened with New Zealand regarding the river Ganges. Yeah. So I think initiatives like this from New Zealand can spread out around the world. I think wherever this work that we're doing now goes, it's got to go towards the realisation of Matike Mai, the Māori constitutional reform that we heard about yesterday. I believe that we must take that on board as the end point of the project we're doing now. So thanks for hearing me out.
Thank you. This is a really fascinating analogy. And in fact, you're talking about little old New Zealand, and that's a question that has come up here. What power does New Zealand have as a very small economy and a small purchaser of overseas products and services? Negotiations are best founded on both parties having different but very equal influence, and we're in a situation where we're on the surface, it seems that we're very tiny, but actually India was in a position that it was perceived not as a small nation, but certainly as a developing nation. So do you think that there's, what are the messages in that for the way that India has, developed itself, the way New Zealand has got something to offer?
So It's interesting. I'm in a new place where, we are talking about rights in a very radical, different, in India we are very radical. We think differently. We think about land, we think about rights, we think about water. We're thinking about, the movements are very vibrant in India, and we are part, as access to treatment, we are part of that. So, from my experience of looking at pharmaceuticals, because that's where I can actually speak, I think the best thing that works for us is competition. And we just fail to understand that, not in terms of services, but in terms of goods. So if you look at pharmaceutical medicines, New Zealand may be small, but it has the ability to pay for its medicines. And that's a very important factor to remember. Negotiations really work very well when you have competitors, You got imatinib from Novartis, but you got imatinib from Cipla as well. And you got imatinib from Reddy's as well. And that's when you can actually get a price which is very useful for New Zealand. And I think it doesn't matter how small you are, if you have an efficient procurement system, which New Zealand does have, you do have the ability to attract producers of medicines to give you good low prices. The problem being that the monopolies are increasing and they're blocking out competition. So you do have an efficient procurement system, you are able to negotiate, but you cannot negotiate in a vacuum. And the vacuum that they're trying to create is the monopolies that they're trying to create. I think this is really very important to remember, that New Zealand does have a very efficient procurement system that needs to be preserved. And needs to have more ability to negotiate what's best for people here in New Zealand.
In fact, it was a point that Don Matheson made about Pharmac that has been, an extremely successful model in getting our medicines are substantially cheaper. I think 2/3 cheaper than the United States and cheaper than Australia. And he was saying that we've got sufficient protections here and we're a small market, so it doesn't matter. But the value of Pharmac as a model for developing countries like Thailand and Vietnam that don't have drug purchasing agencies is really, really important. And yes?
So I just wanted to say this, that, we tend to compare ourselves constantly to Australia and United States, and that's what I would not do. As New Zealand, I would not do that. The United States prices are inflated to a point that if you start comparing, any deal seems better than that, okay? And I think this is a mistake. I would compare, and Thailand actually has built a universal healthcare system which is actually negotiating and bringing down prices, and they do something which actually New Zealand could utilize. They use compulsory licensing often. They try and get in the competitors through licensing. And I think this is very important, and if you look at the prices that New Zealand pays, if you ask me and you compare the prices MSF pays a fraction of the prices that New Zealand is paying. I mean, if you look at hepatitis C medicines, we pay $120 a treatment, which is 3 months of treatment. I believe New Zealand is paying about $10,000. Of course, you compare it to the United States, which is $50,000, $60,000, it seems like a really great price. But if you ask an MSF pharmacist, they'll say, no, you got a really bad deal. Who negotiated your prices? 10,000 is too much. So I think this thing has to change. We have to stop comparing ourselves to the United States in terms of pricing. We need to look out there. There's a world of countries who are opening up and looking at generics as an option. And how do you price generics is relating to the cost of production and the quality. And building capacity on that level is very important. And actually the trade agreements are something that we need to oppose tooth and nail as hard as we can. And that's what MSF has been doing from day one when, NAFTA and Central American free trade agreements were being negotiated. And, our job in India is to simply keep the free trade agreements out on pharmaceuticals. They just don't work. There's no transparency. And this is an unequal relationship. It's a very colonizer's kind of attitude, that you don't know what's good for you, we'll tell you what's good for you, and you've got to adopt it because, some people sat across the table and negotiated a deal. The trade agreements have language which is very ambiguous, and when Louis mentioned language, it excites me because I'm a lawyer too. So they're very smart. They put in the nice language, and then they pull all the other crap out there that messes us up, in terms of access to treatment. And I think this is the problem with free trade agreements, and that's why we are opposing them. We need to oppose them openly as you know, as movements, as people. When the EU-India free trade agreement was being negotiated, thousands of people came to New Delhi to show their opposition to the free trade agreement. Unfortunately, we are not mobilizing at that level as people, as movements, as, you know, to show our opposition to these free trade agreements. And they always get away by telling us, oh, you'll get something in exchange. And something in exchange means what? You know, New Zealand wants the opening of the dairy market, okay? India is a very big dairy market for them. But India has got small farmers running their own dairy cooperatives, you know. So who should you know, I mean, these are situations where, you know, people need to talk to each other, because I'm sure people in New Zealand don't want the small farmers to lose out in a free trade agreement over dairy. And this is something that is really very problematic. So they're going after very fundamental areas, and medicines is unfortunately part of it. And I won't go into services, because in India, everyone wants the private healthcare market, because people like me who have no access to healthcare from the government have to buy services through the private healthcare sector. So we are just basically consumers for them. And India is a billion-plus market for them. So the opening up of the healthcare services market in a country like India, where 1 billion people live, is huge for industries, huge for corporations. And they definitely want that. They don't want public healthcare systems to exist. They don't want UK's NICE, they don't want NHS to survive, they don't want Pharmac to survive, because they want to take over the markets. And this is the problem that we have with these free trade agreements. There's no justification for them. You can't justify them on any ground. Unfortunately, as a human rights lawyer, I just can't find any justification for these free trade agreements. And this is very difficult. We should say this as openly as we can.
It's fairly radical, you're right.
You know, I grew up in a, you know, Indians are not right or left. They are very money-minded people. The middle class of India is very money-minded. We grew up in extremely difficult situations. I'm a post-partition kid, came from Pakistan to India, family lost everything. The other side came from Burma, we had nothing. All we care about is putting the next 2 meals, getting our children in school. We're not commies, we're not left, we're not right. But this seems just completely wrong, the way the free trade agreements are trying to, you know, take away the ability of governments to protect life. And in that sense, I think, I feel that, you know, there's no, if you could justify them on any ground, so do so, but there is no justification. On labor, they are creating problems. On farming and farmers and agriculture, they're creating problems. On environment, there's no question. ISDS has totally ensured that corporations can take over our land and exploit them in a fashion that is not in line with environmental practices. You've got medicines out there. Show me one area where any of us would benefit from these free trade agreements, and then we should talk about them. But they, at the moment, offer none of that, to, at least from a perspective of, if you ask me as an Indian, they don't offer any of that.
So that's... I hope MFAT's watching. You've just done them out of a job. Michael, have you got something?
I just want to pick up on a couple of the threads there, and I think that the Zika virus outbreak in South America is a really good example about what we're talking here, because there's some lessons that we've completely failed to learn through that. Zika wasn't about just about a vaccination and where you might go to get that vaccination and who might administer it. It was about the importance of good waste removal so that there was no still water lying in the streets where the mosquitoes could breed. It was about personal protective equipment. It was about community education. So you can see that the Zika virus really is about a holistic approach to healthcare and a whole of government approach to healthcare. And I really like the modelling that George outlined based on the Maori principles. And I think that you know, the underlying principle of using the Indigenous environment based philosophies can be really helpful because of that holistic approach that they tend to take. And as a long-term goal, that's really good. as a middle-term goal for our movement, you know, we should be looking at getting governments to do whole-of-government health impact assessments of trade agreements, not narrowly focused impact assessments. I mean, they don't do any health impact assessments, but they need to be broad, and our understanding of health needs to be broad. I just want to pick, and you know, so focusing on healthcare provision and what that means for societies is a good way for us to tap in and get that engagement from the broader communities. But I just want to pick up on a point that George made. I don't think it's useful to see corporations as alien automons that make their own self-programming decisions, right? People make decisions. People at the top of corporations make decisions. We need to identify them, name them and shame them because it's people that can make the decisions to reverse that. Whether it's the politicians or whether it's the corporates, we need to be naming the people that are failing to make the right decisions on behalf of communities.
Oh. I'd just like to make a couple of points that sort of are springing from a couple of points made by, all the points made by my really eloquent panellists. And that is the themes, really, of economic growth and economic sustainability, plus this metaphor of space that George talked about. So I just want to throw in the mix that I think to manage environmental goals such as survival on the planet, but twinned with the idea of social justice that a couple of us have also talked about, the right to development, that both my fellow panelists have talked about as well. I think we in the West, and the richer people within the West, such as many of us in this room, need to give up, basically, some of our claims to wealth and prosperity, that extra washing machine or whatever it is. Because economic growth, in terms of unfettered growth, is not compatible with climate change and environmental protection. It's just simply not compatible. We have to accept a new form of economic sustainability. And I think trade and investment agreements, new forms, kind of have to recognise that and provide ways for there to be space for some disadvantaged groups and countries still in development, such as India. So they need more space to develop economically, and richer countries and richer people within countries need to give up some of their space, some of their claims to economic well-being. In one sense, the idea of having less for some and more for others, I think, has to be built into new trade and investment agreements. Because there isn't enough space, basically, for everybody in the world to have 3 houses and 5 cars and 2 sets of washing machines. So a new form of economic growth. I actually do think, I do love that metaphor of corporations as extraterritorial, because I think it's not just the person, I think it is partly the person, but I think sometimes we are capable in our Western world of creating systems that are more evil than ourselves. And I think that that's what we have done with corporations. It's not just the last 25, 30 years of laissez-faire neoliberalism. I think that capitalism and the sanctity with which we have given various forms of corporations have not always existed the way they have, but it's that form of the quest for riches, which is sort of understandable if you're a poorer person, like all of us have been for the last, up until the last 150 years. I think now we have to be in a position to set our aims in a more nuanced way, where some of us are going to have less claims to economic wealth and some of us have more. So we need to reconcile, basically, environmental change and social justice.
Thank you. And that's a great place to end. Thanks very much. Can I didn't give round to everybody's question, but they will all be posted and they will all be answered at some stage. And I think that that's a good place to end. Equity. Health for all means equity. So thanks very much indeed. Thank our panellists.
did not think I would not hear my alarm, so I'm so sorry.
Thank you so much.
And you can play another next one.